Pranams to all the distinguished, eminent audience here, respected Kanak Sabhapati ji, who is chairing this session, and my colleagues here. So in the brief time given, I'll try to cover these points. If some are not covered, you can take it that it's covered. First, I will say something about the primacy of Varta, that's agriculture, cattle protection and trade. And that in Indian tradition, king is not only the protector of Dharma, but he is also the protector of Varta. Then how India did follow this primacy of Varta in history, and how this went into a serious decline under the British rule, this I will only say in few words. But main idea will be to present Pandit Deen Dayal Ji's vision of India's economic development founded on the primacy of Krishi. Basically, this he propounded in, of course, in several lectures and all that, but Bharatiya Arthaniti, Vikas ka ek drishti, a sort of a monograph he wrote in 1958 as a critique of the second five-year plan that was being undertaken then. He has, of course, spoken about in detail in his lectures on Ekatma Manavvad also. But the nation has not paid any attention to his sane advice, and I would like to indicate how that has led to India really lagging behind seriously amongst the nations of the world. I will also say this is all about the production part of Indian economy, but I will also say something about how Indian polity historically has ensured distribution by following the classical Indian discipline of growing and sharing in plenty. So the ideal was Ramarajya, and one of the most important things was Durbhiksha Bhayavarjitaha and Nagarani cha Rashtrani Dhanadhanya Yutani cha. These are the two very great aspects of the ideal of Ramarajya. So in India, what is commonly called economic activities today is encompassed by the basic word Varta. And according to Kautilya, Krishi, Pashupalye, Vanijyacha, Varta, agriculture, animal husbandry and trade. So these are the primary productive activities in India. In modern economies, especially in the last 2-3 centuries, industrial production based on mined minerals and mineral oil for energy has replaced agriculture and animal husbandry as the primary productive activity. But even then, in most of the world, agriculture and animal husbandry continue to form the basic substratum on which the rest of the activity is structured and flourishes, and basically in sustainable, robust economies, this is indeed so. Very crucially, Varta requires protection. Such protection is explicitly enjoined in our tradition, in all our texts, upon the state, the kings of India. And so, as I said earlier, king is the protector. So in Mahabharata, the primacy of Krishi, Goraksha, Vanijya, Lokanamiva iha jivanam. That is the very the life of the world. This is what Bhishma Pitamaha is telling Yudhishthira. And he is explaining to Yudhishthira that the cultivators are not reduced to deserting the country. It's because it's the cultivators who carry the burden of the king on their shoulders. They also carry and provide for the sustenance of all others. Ye vahanti dhuram rajyam te bharanti itaranapi. The same thing we see Bhagavan Sri Ramchandra reminding Bharata when he comes to meet them in Chitrakuta. And the very important aspect of protecting Varta is maintaining irrigation. And one of the main things that Ramchandra is telling, Kachit Rashtre Tadakani Purnani cha Brihanti cha. No, that's Narada in Mahabharata. The Kachit Chaitya Shataihi Jushtaha Sunivishta Janakulaha Devasthanehi Prapabhishta Tatakaihi Upashobhitaha Adeva Matriko Ramyaha. So the main point is the agriculture should not be left to the mercy of gods alone, that it should not be Deva Matrika. We have to provide for adequate irrigation, which as per all accounts, we see the most of the inscriptions in India deal with how the irrigation reservoirs were maintained in India. Okay, so the agricultural development of India, there are many detailed historical records, we will not go into it, but the plenty became scarcity from about the end of 18th century, and it lasted through most of 19th century. So how we had to rebuild the nation after our independence was the crucial issue. And I now come to Deen Dayal Ji's. So as we all know, Deen Dayal Ji was deeply learned in the Indian traditional lore, and he had a very close association with the people's mind and people's practices. So in his writings, he has emphasized the fact that the civilizational essence of India is what is called the Chiti, and that is to be awakened with the prana of the Virata. And then he says, we need to combine this to build a nation, but this nation should take into account pride in our holy, glorious past, but we wish neither to make this country a shadow of some distant past, nor an imitation of Russia or America. They have a very clear vision that in today's context, we have to have a new civilizational assertion of India, which is rooted in Indian tradition, but it was not going to be merely an imitation of the past. And here, he emphasizes the primacy of agriculture and the primacy of food in maintaining the society, food, clothing, shelter. After talking about it, he talks of food as the most important one, the old saying, Annam vai pranaha. And so, the primacy of agriculture is what he emphasizes. And there, what we need to understand is that agriculture needs to have a higher priority than all other economic activities. So this was the argument that arose in 1950s between the model of development that was being advocated largely by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru ji and what Pandit Deen Dayal Ji was wanting to say. The order of priorities in Indian economy that it adopted post-independence placed much greater emphasis on trying to develop the sector of what is called the services. In fact, Nehruji's main model was to create a fairly substantial middle class in India by taking the resources, the surplus from the agriculture, to support this middle class, largely composed of government servants and other allied sectors, and then was trade, and then was manufacture, and finally was agriculture. This was the order of priority that independent India set for itself. And what Deen Dayal Ji was trying to argue was for the exact reverse of this vision of India's reconstruction, nation building. So the role of agriculture became reduced only to provide cheap food and raw materials for the other sectors of Indian economy. And this we can see easily in the skewed contributions to our economy from different sectors. For instance, it is said that in 1951, agriculture constituted about 58%, agriculture and allied services constituted about 58% of Indian economy. It supported about perhaps 65% of our population. But by 2013, that's because these are calculated at what is called constant prices. So at 2013, agriculture had come down to 18% of the total Indian economy, though it continued to support almost around 50% of our population. So there has been much debate not only in India, but many countries of the world which also got free around the same time as India and were charting out their new path. But most countries which did develop very fast showed the kind of understanding that Deen Dayal Ji was talking about, that they gave a great importance to growth in agriculture and then used that sort of a flourishing agriculture sector to actually support the growth of industry and services. And that way, they were able to achieve fair amount of growth within couple of decades after having succeeded in the sector of agriculture. They were able to demonstrate fair amount of growth in industry and services also. But we could not follow this. And to some extent, if you look at India's economic indices, we seem to be lagging behind significantly. So in the next 2-3 minutes, I'll try to explain to you where we are really lacking very seriously. So this is the food grain production of India. Food grains means rice, wheat, the millets, and then pulses. So as you can see, we have a fairly large amount of cultivable land, more than 100 million hectares, more than China. It's almost double that of United States, and it's about 1/3 of the entire agricultural land available in Asia. But our food production has lagged far behind the comparable levels. United States, which is growing in half the Indian land, has about 400 million tons currently. India is producing around 317. And China is producing about 569 million tons of food grains annually. But as you can see, in 1961, China was marginally ahead, barely ahead of India. By 1981, just before it started what we now call as the open economic liberal policy, it had already become twice the level of food production in India, from 131 million tons to 243 by 1981. So the two important indices are the yield, or the amount of food grains produced per hectare, which currently in India is about 2.4 tons. It's 5.6 tons in China, 8 tons in US, 3.8 tons is the average in Asia, and nearly 4 tons is the average in the entire world. In 1961, India and China had almost comparable yields of agriculture. So was whole of Asia. The world average was also not too different. But today, they are all almost double or more than double the yield of, the agricultural yield is more than double per hectare. Even more crucial is the amounts of food grains available per person per year, per capita. This in kilograms. Current is, India is 222 kilograms. But as you can see, from 61 to 2001, it's going around 181, 187, 196. It's only in the last 6-7 years that we have crossed this 200 kilograms per person per year. A very important historical point that we should pay attention to. In 1880s, when what is called these various famine commissions were set up, it was determined that a food grain production of about 200 kilograms is the absolute lowest minimum that we should have, not to have satisfactory food production for all, but to barely be able to avoid what are called famine deaths. So, for even about 60-70 years of our independence, we have not even crossed this 200 kilograms per person per year. Whereas this has been crossed in China around 239. In Asia also, the world was far ahead. Today, China has about 400 kilograms per person. US, of course, 1,200. Asia is 272. And the world has about 360. It means that it's not that the 1,000 kilograms per person are eaten by humans. It means that a large amount of it is also used to feed the animals. And in fact, Indian food production is such that most of our animals are emaciated and hardly can be said to have adequate nutrition. This is one of the main points I wanted to make. This is what we sort of emphasized about 30 years ago when we tried to write this Annam Bahukurvita, that this is the current sort of situation in India, but this is contrary to both the classical Indian discipline of Annam Bahukurvita. It's also against the kind of economic policies that wise men like Pandit Deen Dayal Ji were advocating. So now I just go very quickly to the distribution side of our economy. The main point that traditionally our political arrangements were organized was to ensure two different things. I mean, they are so closely related, but two very important things. One is that no living being is ever deprived of sustenance. To see that every living being is able to sustain, food is freely available. Second is, all sectors of economy obtain their due share through the agricultural production. So, all sectors of society also. So for the former thing, we have very strong injunctions from classical literature, which have been emphasized in that book. It's filled with all these quotations. And I'll just quickly tell you, the main philosophical principle on which the Indian political economy is organized is that the universe is an interconnection of things. And the interconnection between humans and the rest of the world is a give and take. And this operates through essentially food or anna. And it's the dharma or the fundamental duty of every person to keep this interconnection, this cycle of interconnection moving. And this is organized through the performance of what we all know, the great, our religious and the secular and the universal ritual, which we call yajna. Yajna is the name for sharing and caring in whatever sector of economy that we operate. And this is emphasized in great classical texts like Gita, Upanishads, etc. It's called the Dharma Chakra in Gita. So I will not explain these verses. All of you are very well aware of this. This is the chapter 3 of Gita, where basically that it's the food that is left after yajna, that is after sharing with all others, that is to be consumed. That is what is called reasonably consumed food. Otherwise, one is only bhunjate tet pagham papaha ye pachanti atma karanat. So it's in Rigveda, it's kevalagho bhavati kevaladi. So one who consumes without sharing is essentially consuming sin. And then evam pravartitam chakram. This is the dharma chakra of Bhagavan Shri Krishna, which actually the Paramacharya of Kanchi Kamakoti Peetham, Chandrasekharendra Saraswati Ji, sort of told the country in his message to the nation when the nation, India, acquired independence on August 1947. So this is of course there in Taittiriya Upanishad. And the main way in which an individual or a householder or a grihastha, which is the unit of Indian polity, Indian society, the main way a family has to adopt this dharma is by the performance of this nitya karma, the most important yajna. That's why it's called the Pancha Mahayajna, where you satisfy the devas, the rishis, the guests and the other manushyas, the pitras and the bhutas. And this Pancha Mahayajna is the essence that every grihastha has to follow. Pujayitva tatah paschat grihastha sheshabhuk bhavet. After performing and satisfying, sharing with all these, a grihastha has to enjoy his food. And there it's mentioned by Manu that both the dampati should eat together after satisfying all this. And again the same word that occurs in Gita, agham sa kevalam bhumte yah pachatya atma karanat. And on the king, the discipline that is enjoined is even more pervasive. The entire society comes under his care. And what Apastamba Dharma Sutra says, that nobody should suffer from hunger or disease or from extremes of heat and cold. No one in the kingdom ought to suffer thus, either because of general scarcity or because of specific design against it. So, one aspect of distribution, that every being in the surroundings and in the society has to have sustenance of food. Agricultural production should be such, should be enough to ensure this, is the one aspect of distribution. The other aspect of distribution, that every section of society receives adequate sort of recompense. The food production should be such that they receive adequate recompense. This we see very clearly in this study of the Chengalpet economy, started by Dharampalji about 30-40 years ago, which is very clearly explained with respect to two villages by Bajajji and myself in a book recently. So there, the first thing is that the annual production of food grains in these localities, which is not in a very fertile area, it's in the region of northern Tamil Nadu called Chengalpet, around Madras city. The production was such that it was 1 ton of food grains were produced per capita, which as I said is nearly 5 times what we are producing today. Only half the households were what may be called living on agriculture, and so the rest of the population was in other sectors of artisanal manufacture and services, trade and militia. And 1/3 of the produce was assigned to all individuals, institutions, and bodies that performed various services in the locality, which ensured that every sort of person and every institution in locality had adequate support. So the last slide. So what we want to do is to establish a robust, affluent, and caring Indian economy, an economy based on primacy of agriculture and cattle protection, and an extensive system of sharing of the produce and distribution, both at the local level and otherwise. And we see many countries in the world doing this fairly effectively. And so this is not something that is returned to some idyllic pre-modern age. This is the functioning modern age, is one where this first condition is satisfied. And to do it in the Indian way, we need to take our classical texts seriously, the practices of our people seriously, and then incorporate them into modern economy. And we can learn a lot from what Pandit Deen Dayal Ji has said. And once we do it, I'm sure in a decade or two, we would see an example of an all-encompassing, caring, and affluent Indian economy that would make India an example for all the world to follow. Thank you very much.